What does not kill me makes me stronger.
This is the Will to Joy podcast. Will to Joy is a resource for personal growth and transcendence based on the extraordinary teachings of Friedrich Nietzsche.
Hello, one and all, and welcome to the Will to Joy podcast. Your host, Jimmy, here. How are you doing? Have a special episode for you today because after this introduction, I'm going to play to you an audio recording of my presentation at the Friedrich Nietzsche Society conference in Belfast, Northern Ireland, last Saturday, 6th of September. And the conference is the reason that this is coming to you a week later than the usual release date. I was away in Northern Ireland at the conference, and it would have just been too difficult to try and produce and release a podcast whilst hobnobbing with academics. So I made a recording anyway of my talk, and I believe it's a topic that will interest you. The title of my paper was An Economy of Bodies, and it's a Nietzschean take on sex, beauty, culture, social status, and what Nietzsche calls ascending life. It marries Nietzsche's philosophy with evolutionary psychology and behavioural science, the latter of which is my professional background. So this, being an academic conference, required an academic take, and so my presentation is kind of academic, but it's relevant for us here because the practical implications of the ideas I discuss are really profound in terms of life experience and life chances. Obviously, I didn't really explore those practical implications in my presentation at the conference, but I will be doing so with you guys. And in fact, I'm planning to work this material up into a practical guide in the next month or so, and I'm going to publish it as a book through Amazon's Kindle Direct Publishing, which enables you to make a book available to people interested in it incredibly quickly. I've been writing on all these matters for years now, so I'm envisioning this being a relatively quick job to crystallise into something punchy, insightful, interesting and practically useful. So I'm excited about producing that because I've been writing for such a long time and I haven't been able to experience the joy of completion on anything. So this is likely to be the first book in a series, so look out for that. So what is the Friedrich Nietzsche Society? Well, it's an organisation, academic organisation, though not exclusively. You can join it even if you're not an academic. All you need is an interest in Nietzsche's works. And it publishes papers. It has a podcast, which I have to say I haven't really listened to, but maybe I should. And it publishes papers. It runs some competitions. And once a year, it has an academic conference where everyone gets together for 3 days and presents their different interpretations of Nietzsche, different papers, and eats lunch, goes for a few drinks afterwards, all that good stuff. So it's really a symposium, I suppose, appropriately enough. A symposium of Nietzsche academics, professors, lecturers in philosophy and PhD students. There were only 2 of us there who were not in academia, out of, I guess, maybe 70 delegates. So me and this other guy were called on the programme, somewhat grandly, independent scholars. Didn't actually get a chance to speak to the other guy. I didn't manage to find him, but maybe next year. Attendees at the conference were from all over Europe, France, Holland, Germany, the UK. There were some Italians and Spanish. But interestingly, the majority of delegates were from the United States, which is quite impressive, really, because it's really is a commitment to fly 6 to 8 hours across the Atlantic. But then again, I suppose being academics, their university pays for their attendance, so that makes it a little bit easier to swallow. It was slightly surreal for me, the conference, actually, because there were several people there who are reputable Nietzsche experts whose books I've read and have in my library, some of which I've studied thoroughly. People like Bernard Regenster, if you know him. He wrote a book, an excellent book called Nietzsche's Affirmation of Life. That book is about nihilism. I do recommend it. I could reel off other names, but if you're not interested in academic philosophy, they'll mean nothing to you. And of course, we are not concerned with academic philosophy here. As you know, if you've been listening to me over this first series of the Will to Joy podcast, Nietzsche was deeply sceptical of academia. And this conclave of Nietzsche enthusiasts are only too aware of the irony of holding an academic conference centred around his philosophy. As one of the keynote speakers noted in their presentation, if Nietzsche could see this, he would no doubt be delighted with the attention, because his work was largely ignored during his career, but just as appalled too. As Nietzsche writes in his Untimely Meditations, quote, "The only critique of a philosophy that is possible and that proves something, namely trying to see whether one can live in accordance with it, has never been taught at universities. All that's ever been taught is a critique of words by means of other words." Unquote. Well, yes, one can't escape the fact that this conference was a critique of words by means of other words. But still valuable and stimulating, I think. Academics are constrained by the requirements of their profession. I myself had to yield to these requirements with my paper and presentation, engaging with contemporary debates in academic discourse, making sure I strove for objectivity, even though Nietzsche doesn't believe objectivity is even remotely possible, and providing copious citations and support for my ideas, conventions which of course Nietzsche never bothered with. Well, that's what it is to be an academic, but for me, though no school sponsors my work or pays for my plane ticket, I get to enjoy the freedom of being able to go further than theory, to try and develop something practical for the benefit of real people in real life, like you. Interestingly, a few Guinnesses were imbibed in the evenings after the conference wound up for the day, and one academic told me just how furious the one-upmanship was in academia, the desire for status and esteem within the field. So even these cool, measured academics are flesh and blood humans. Nietzsche, of course, had already made that searing psychological observation in unequivocal terms 150 years ago. But yeah, interesting. Actually, let me shout out to Rob from Rhode Island, a philosophy professor with whom I had a few very amusing conversations over the course of the weekend. Recently, he produced a guide to Nietzsche's gay science for Edinburgh Critical Guides, and it's a book I intend to read. And if it's written with the charm and amiability of its author, I'm sure it will be delightful. So, recommendation to you to check that out. Nietzsche's Gay Science, A Critical Introduction and Guide by Robert Miner. Miner with an E. He's got some other philosophy books too on Thomas Aquinas and what have you. So, a great conference. Fascinating people. Good lunches. Very important, of course. Remember, Nietzsche's philosophy is an embodied philosophy, so taking care of the body is an absolute priority. And Belfast is a great city to visit. I wouldn't go there for the weather. It barely stopped raining for the whole trip. But this is not without its own upside. Belfast is very flat as cities go, and it has some wonderful architecture. But what really struck me was the surrounding countryside. You look down these long, straight streets and you can see for maybe 3 or 4 miles. Then abruptly rearing up from the plain are the seemingly very steep and very high green hills. Belfast is surrounded by them, except on the Dockland side, of course. The city seems to sit in a verdant bowl, actually quite surreal. Now, without the rain, it couldn't be as green as it is, so one benefit of a damp climate. I really wanted to hike out there and experience that countryside, but there wasn't time. Maybe next time I'm in Belfast. I'll certainly be attending next year. Apparently it will be staged in Athens in 2026, which, as you know, is the birthplace of Western philosophy, so that feels very appropriate. And one more piece of exciting news. There's plans afoot for me to guest on the Nietzsche podcast, which if you are a Nietzsche fan, you will no doubt be aware of. For me, it's the only Nietzsche podcast worth my time, apart from this one, obviously. But our focus here is very different. Will to Joy is a very different beast. Anyway, if that comes off, I'll be delighted because I love that podcast and I've been listening to Keegan, the presenter over there, waxing on Nietzsche almost since he started back in the summer of 2021. Fingers crossed, and I'll keep you posted. Righto, before we move on to the actual presentation, I'll need to brief you on a few Nietzsche essentials that we may not have covered in the podcast to date, but which are prerequisites for understanding my presentation. Obviously, I prepared it for an audience that would already understand Nietzschean philosophy in depth. So for you, I'm going to outline some of the basics that will help you get the most from my presentation. All that right after this important message. Will to Joy is a new and tender green shoot striving towards the light. If it's going to thrive, it needs the sunshine and gentle rain of your support. If you find value here, support me by doing a few simple things. Hit follow so you don't miss the next episode. Follow Will to Joy on all the main social media platforms. Drop the podcast a review. I'd love to hear your feedback. If you know people who get something from this material, please do share it with them. And please consider supporting me in this project for a few dollars a month. There's a link in the show's description. And if you feel ready for it, you can now also become a De Profundis member on Patreon with exclusive episodes that delve deeper into Nietzsche's philosophy for life. Link also in the show's description. Your support will ensure that I can keep producing the Will to Joy podcast to support you in your own flourishing. Thank you. Okay, so an economy of bodies. What is this paper about? It's essentially an extension of Nietzsche's philosophy of aesthetics, centred in and stemming from sexual attraction, which means it's something about the body. And not just because we're attracted to beautiful bodies, but because it's bodies that perceive and respond to beauty themselves, physiologically. I explore the aesthetic sensibility's profound effects on human social existence and personal destiny. My paper addresses questions like, what is beauty? Why do we find things beautiful? How does our aesthetic sensibility contribute to culture and aesthetic expression in the most general sense? And I mean here things like art, myth, and even religion. The account I shall give is naturalistic, meaning there's no room for supernatural or metaphysical explanations. In the paper I mentioned the Dionysian-Apollonian dialectic. I don't think we've covered that in terms of art, but this is the dual character of artistic creation for Nietzsche. The god Dionysus represents the inexpressible, irrational, creative impetus to create, and the god Apollo represents the ability to take that amorphous energy and shape it into something intelligible, to give form to the force. I also mentioned disinterested aesthetics, which was the claim of Kant and Schopenhauer, that artistic appreciation provides pleasure because it disengages us from our own interests. Nietzsche completely rejects this. To desire the pleasure of aesthetic experience is to be interested, quite obviously, right? I also mention aesthetics as style and interpretation, and this is a reading of Nietzsche's aesthetics that I'm not hostile to. Yes, our aesthetic discrimination is often turned on ourselves, towards making our own lives into artworks, and this is briefly touched on in the presentation. Among my starting premises are the denial of God or any other worlds beyond this one. Remember, we're trying to come up with a naturalistic account here, one that can be proved in principle in the real empirical world. As such, I take Darwinian natural selection to be true, the theory that best accords with the facts of the world as they can be ascertained. So, don't listen to creationists. Usually they don't understand evolution enough to be attacking it, and when they do, which is rarely in my experience, they are being disingenuous. The nature of will to power is a subject of debate. Some see it as a purely psychological predisposition to desire power in human beings. Others think of it as an instinctive drive in all living organisms. I'm convinced of the most comprehensive interpretation. Will to power is just everything that happens. It's a description of every kind of phenomenon whatsoever. Will to power is just all happening. I won't go into this too much further now because in our next and final episode of this first season, I'm going to give you the most thoroughly and textually faithful interpretation of Nietzsche's will to power that I've ever been able to find on the internet, or better than anything I've ever been able to find on the internet. A theory I think may be largely my own, and which I think provides the most satisfactory account of what Nietzsche was really driving at. That said, you might be able to glean from my presentation what my position is ahead of the next show. Another thing to note, Nietzsche didn't believe in things. Not that he thought they didn't exist at all, or that they were illusions or holograms, just that language requires nouns as its basic constituents. Rocks, cars, eyeballs, chairs, cheeseburgers, aeroplanes, etc., etc. These things exist as collections of effects, as phenomena, but they must be abstracted out of their environment so we can talk about them. Language takes a single, unified but variegated field, the world, the environment, and turns it instead into a space full of objects. This is a subtle point because it's hard for us to imagine what the world would look like before it's differentiated into discrete objects. But I imagine human infants see the world like this until they are inculcated into language. Consider, what does your cat experience when it encounters your slippers? Certainly something, but certainly not slippers. Anyway, enough of that for now. There's a full paper to go with this presentation, and my presentation's actually a compressed version to fit within the time allotted on the conference programme, but I'll record the full version for the De Profundis members on Patreon. So if you want to hear that, and more deeper dive material generally, including practical techniques, consider supporting me on Patreon. It wouldn't so much help me to keep the lights on as enable me to turn the lights on, and in fact probably just would enable me to buy some lights. Anyway, with no further hesitation, prevarication or procrastination, I present to you An Economy of Bodies. Okay, hi everyone. My paper is entitled An Economy of Bodies, a Nietzschean genealogy of sex, beauty, culture and destiny. How does Nietzsche's notion of the aesthetic sensibility inform our understanding of the development of culture, social structures, and both individual and collective life under conditions of civilization? For Nietzsche, art is not mere decoration. Only as aesthetic phenomenon is existence in the world eternally justified, as he famously put it in The Birth of Tragedy, a sentiment later modified in Gay Science 107. And in Twilight of the Idols, he calls art the great stimulus to life, arguing that it aims, evaluates, and underlies our desire for life. How could one understand it as purposeless, he asks, and avers that life is the meaning of art. This paper elaborates an interpretation of Nietzsche's conception of art and the aesthetic in this expansive and life-affirming sense. The question is an old and venerable one, whether our highest values derive from transcendental orders, as in Plato, Kant, and Christianity, or from the embodied unconscious logic of will to power and natural selection. The existing scholarship on Nietzsche's aesthetics frequently examines the Apollonian Dionysian dialectic, his critique of disinterested aesthetics, or his account of beauty as style and interpretation, for instance in Nehamas. More explicitly naturalistic and Darwinian readings, by contrast, treat beauty as continuous with Nietzsche's biological and psychological concerns, notably John Richardson. Purely evolutionary biological interpretations have also been undertaken, but the sexual aesthetic core remains underexplored. While Nietzsche's view of culture as the sublimation of instincts is acknowledged, the aesthetic sensibilities escape from its reproductive sphere, transfiguration into non-sexual forms, and its appropriation as culture remains under-examined, as does the ways it covertly shapes human power relations and social hierarchies today. I follow others, especially Richardson and Moore, in arguing that aesthetic experience originates in the recognition of reproductive fitness in potential mates, and trace how it's been redirected and appropriated in culture. I begin to tread new ground, I suggest, when I propose that culture is the expression of displaced sexual energy repurposed as social glue for the benefit of the herd entity we call society. Similarly, I claim that the dynamics of will to power implicit in the aesthetics of reproductive fitness profoundly structure individual life chances, even within contemporary society where contrary values supposedly prevail. This paper integrates Nietzsche's philosophy with evolutionary psychology and behavioural science. It clarifies Nietzsche's aesthetic doctrine and furnishes a naturalistic genealogy of culture and social structure. It exposes the biological foundations beneath our most revered values, anchored in bodily orientation towards something that feels transcendent. The metaphysicians and mystics are onto something, I suggest. Beauty does point to something transcendent, but not transcendental. My starting premises are naturalistic. No God, no metaphysical beyond is needed. Darwinian evolution by natural selection is taken as valid. Its competitive and adaptive logic shapes both physiology and psychology, without conscious purpose or ultimate goal. Humans, like other animals, are driven by an instinctive imperative, survival for reproduction, designed in by natural selection, but operating largely without awareness. While some commentators restrict the will to power to a psychological thesis about human motivation, for instance Clarke and Katsafanas, I follow the broad cosmological interpretation of Nietzsche's will to power, a fundamental principle of all phenomena, with conscious, purposive willing merely a, quote, development and ramification of one basic form of will, unquote. And that's Beyond Good and Evil 36. Following Heraclitus, whom Nietzsche hailed as his precursor, this is a world of becoming, inherently heterogeneous, unstable, and active. Things are anthropocentric fictions, reified by language and the demands of practical reason. As Nietzsche puts it, quote, a thing is the sum of its effects, synthetically bound together by a concept, an image, unquote. From this standpoint, power is the capacity to have effects that matter from some perspective. Since all things just are their effects and perspectives differ, all things are power in some degree. What matters to us is the degree of power in its capacity to affect our interests. Power, then, is better identified as effects, actual and potential, rather than as causes. Like beauty, power is in the eye of the beholder. All this permits a reading of Nietzsche's aesthetic sensibility as an evolved orientation towards what he calls life ascending, an impulsion that persists covertly but powerfully beneath the moralized and collectivized forms of culture. In On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense and elsewhere, Nietzsche asserts that there are no identical things. Equality, he says, is a fiction created by language and logic, a form of practical data compression to enable linguistic communication. Even two golf balls fresh from the same mould differ microscopically. Even identical twins carry tiny genetic variations. Without such variation, evolution could not occur, and none of us would be here. In this world of unequal things, all sentient mobile animals must make choices, They are evaluators. Valuation is motivation. If desire is to have any function, to want something is to be able to go get it. In other animals, instinct turns valuations directly into action. Stimulus seamlessly elicits response. Nietzsche notes its inordinate efficiency. Quote, "One acts perfectly only when one acts instinctively." And that's from Will to Power 440. Humans are different. Though we are for Nietzsche the appraising animal in itself, no other creature evaluates with the same bewildering sophistication, equivocation, or ambivalence. It is this internal conflictedness that also makes us the insane animal in his view. Yet, however confused our judgments, they still govern every choice we make, nowhere with more consequence than in our amorous relationships. Darwin's theory of sexual selection proposes that organisms compete to attract mates and pass on their genes. Over generations, a preference for mates who display signs of fitness, health and symmetry and strength would be selected for, producing a self-reinforcing feedback loop. Those who choose fitness signals tend to produce fitter and similarly choosy offspring. Despite Nietzsche's notorious refutations of what he believed were Darwin's theories, his own view aligns with the direct reproductive utility account. In sexual selection, then, the ability to recognise reproductive fitness provides a plausible, naturalistic explanation for the emergence of the aesthetic sensibility itself. But, if true, how does it explain aesthetic experience that has no obvious connection with reproduction? We'll confront that question shortly. For Nietzsche, our experience of the aesthetic is felt as Rausch, an intoxicating heightening of perception in the presence of beauty. This is not cold rational calculation, it's a preconscious thrill. Rausch is not mere passive rapture, it is active and creative. This heightened state, initially bound to sexual selection, becomes fertile ground for adaptive ingenuity. The same perceptual acuity that detects fitness signals can be turned towards enhancing them, both in oneself and in one's environment, setting the stage for art and cultural production. The human traits that most ignite feelings of Rausch, beauty, health, charisma, competence, wealth, intellect, social skills, I'm calling power traits. They are power because, based on my earlier definition, they create effects that matter to us. They matter a great deal. These power traits map closely onto social hierarchies. Life chances are strongly linked to their possession. Their possession confers advantage in sexual selection, a fundamental preconscious physiological imperative. At the level of instinct, we are all natural eugenicists. Obviously, these innate prejudices clash with our egalitarian ideals and seem horribly unjust. We like to think we have transcended such animal drives, yet we can see evidence of their profound effects everywhere. Social psychology has long observed them. For example, attractive defendants receive lighter sentences in court, and attractive job applicants are more likely to be hired and earn higher salaries than less attractive peers. These aesthetic prejudices have not disappeared then. Rather, under the pressures of civilization, they have been hidden and also forced into new, more acceptable channels. How so? Anthropological evidence tells us that early humans lived in small, kin-based clans, perhaps 20 or 30 individuals. A gear shift came with the emergence of language and its essential scaffolding, reason. For Nietzsche, this marks not only a transformation in social organisation, but a significant moment in the emergence of reflective self-consciousness, as he elaborates in the Gay Science 354, The Genius of the Species. Language enabled unprecedented social organisation and coordination. With it, a group could plan in the abstract, formulate explicit objectives in the future, and even issue conditional instructions. If A, then B. Only C when D. Always E if F. Specialised roles became possible. One might be designated as chaser in the hunt, another as ambusher. Yet the execution of a plan is most effective when leadership is centralised, ideally in the hands of a single capable individual with others subordinating their impulses for independent action. It's plausible, therefore, that the most successful language-using groups developed hierarchies of command and obedience. This new organising power created the conditions for militarised, stratified societies and eventually imperial expansion through conquest, subjugation, exploitation and its enslavement of other human groups. Among pre-linguistic, pre-rational hominins, intergroup raids were likely driven by a natural animus towards competitors for resources and territory, and the compulsion to abduct reproductively viable females, thereby staving off genetic inbreeding. Neither aim required conscious strategy, both could be evolved instincts, irrepressible aggression and sexual desire. Several credible sources argue that in practice, if a rival group could be exterminated, that is, if superior force made its destruction possible, it would be. But once early humans could reason, hypothesizing about potential outcomes and weighing their relative benefits, the most successful groups may have realized that subjugation was more advantageous than extirpation. Tribute-taking or outright slavery could provide sustained material benefits as well as the prestige of mastery. Delegating subsistence work to vassals and slaves freed the conquerors to become a full-time warrior caste, the first nobility. In this way, Nietzsche writes, quote, "The state began on earth," unquote. That's from Genealogy 2:17. Expanding civilizations faced a new problem: how to maintain cohesion within vast non-kin communities where the bonds of blood that had bound small clans together were absent. Those dangerous natural impulses, aggression and sexual desire, intimately entwined, had to be curtailed. Nietzsche concluded that the solution was brutal discipline, Zucht in German, strict rules with harsh and public punishments. Obedience was, as he vividly puts it, burned in. Fear constituted the social straitjacket. The sex drive particularly posed a threat to order and was rigorously controlled. Across ancient cultures, adulterers were punished severely and unrestrained sexual conduct was moralised into something shameful. This repression did not eliminate the drives, it forced them inward, Nietzsche claims, with profound psychological consequences. But there were consequences in the social sphere too. A powerful river dammed creates its own strange new distributaries. This brutal repression did not eliminate the drives. Quote, "Those old instincts had not at all once ceased to make their demands. It's just that it was difficult and seldom possible to yield to them," unquote. The inextinguishable aesthetic sexual impulse broke its banks and emerged in sublimated non-sexual forms: art, ritual, myth, and religion, meaning-making itself. This is why Nietzsche claims that, quote, "the demand for art and beauty is an indirect demand for the ecstasies of sexuality," unquote. Art's roots may predate civilization, perhaps in dance to demonstrate fitness and body paint and ornamentation to enhance sexual appeal, but the repression of the aesthetic sexual impulse in civilization supercharged cultural production. Culture unified ancient communities, invariably promoting a chauvinistic communitarian ethos. As Nietzsche's Zarathustra proclaims, quote, "Never did one neighbour understand the other. Ever was his soul amazed at the neighbour's delusion and wickedness," unquote. Societies that evolved these communitarian ethics and effectively controlled sex and aggression enjoyed stronger internal unity, greater organisation, and were more likely to outcompete less unified rivals. The sublimation of the sexual aesthetic impulse into art, myth, and meaning was, I propose, co-opted as cultural cement, social glue. As Nietzsche writes, quote, "The cause of the genesis of a thing and its final usefulness, its actual employment and integration into a system of purposes lie toto cielo apart. Again and again, interpreted according to new views, monopolised in a new way, transformed and rearranged for a new use by a power superior to it," unquote. That's from Genealogy 2:12, abridged slightly. The very impulses that had been so vehemently repressed once transmuted into non-sexual aesthetic forms, were turned into means of further consolidating the community's identity under a fixed set of beliefs and values. Nietzsche conceives of the society itself as a kind of quasi-organism, an entity with its own will to power, engaged in struggles with rival societies for survival and dominance. Will to power could be thought of as a substrate-neutral form of evolution by natural selection. At the herd level, the welfare of individuals is valued only insofar as it serves the ends of the whole. In every civilization, strength depended on cultural unity, what Nietzsche calls the morality of custom, and this meant the suppression of individuality. On these terms, the ubiquitous ethic of heroic self-sacrifice, whether for king, country, or community, was never really for the benefit of the community, but for the quasi-organism itself, for the herd. The history of civilization, in Nietzsche's account, is a history of man's domestication and homogenization, the clipping of claws, the filing down of teeth, the smothering of instincts by rendering them shameful. Here, the chronic vacillation in human evaluating is explained, and the bifurcation of motivation into ises in tension with oughts. On these terms, humanity has been subordinated to the imperatives of the herd quasi-organisms it dwells within. This is why it became a herd animal. Such was the price of civilization, the pacification of man, his transformation into a productive and tame creature, one deeply discontented without being able to quite put its finger on why. But this formula of cultural chauvinism and conservatism has its dangers. Environmental conditions, climate, terrain, technology, neighbouring peoples, they all change. Every society must therefore be capable of adaptation. And just as species require genetic variation to evolve, so must cultures produce their own mutations. Nietzsche identifies the necessity of rare and exceptional individuals who overturn tradition and challenge prevailing norms, who represent new possibilities for a society. If such figures are not destroyed or exiled, and Nietzsche believes they usually are, they can, and sometimes do, alter the trajectory of an entire civilization. Civilization has not dethroned the sexual aesthetic, it's driven it underground, with marvellous results, of course. This transfiguration of sexual energy into sophisticated cultural expressions underwrites Nietzsche's assertion that, quote, the degree and type of a person's sexuality reaches up into the furthermost peaks of their spirit, unquote. Yet the sensitivity to beauty and its adjacent power traits as a felt orientation to reproductive fitness persists beneath the veneers of culture, morality, and political pretense. Sexual attraction to signs of reproductive fitness remains one of the most potent determinants of human status, opportunity, and life chances. We each hold a fluctuating portfolio of power traits: beauty, health, strength, intelligence, charisma, wealth, influence, and so on. Mating is largely a negotiation for an equitable match. Exceptional assets in one area can offset deficits in another. Everyone is looking for the best deal. They bring their own power traits to market and seek the best possible quantum in return. Supply and demand rule. Value can rise with a promotion or sudden fame, or collapse overnight with illness and bankruptcy. This market invites manipulation. Grooming, ornamentation, and status signalling can inflate perceived value. Valuations are best guesses. And because we tend to lack confidence in our own fallible appraisals, we frequently look to the herd consensus. Even our own value is discovered in the mirror of social intercourse. Our self-worth is reflected back to us in the way that others treat us. In Beyond Good and Evil 261, Nietzsche distinguishes noble pride, valuing oneself, from slavish vanity, dependence on the approval of others. Most of us probably lie somewhere on a spectrum between these extremes, but interestingly, in seeking external validation for our appraisals, we look to the very individual we are evaluating for clues. We are exquisitely attuned to signs of self-confidence in others, and these have a profound effect on our appraisal of them. So genuine confidence, an internal locus of authority, is a meta-power trait and one that can be developed through effort. Here, the rare mutant individual from earlier returns, one who values themselves independently of the herd, a bellwether, a Freigeist, who might even shift the consensus of social values itself. To conclude, Stendhal defined beauty as the promise of happiness. Nietzsche sharpened it to the promise of happiness in ascending life. Sexual attraction is will to power, not only because a high-value mate confers status, or because their valuing of you confirms your own value, but because their power traits portend the survival and enhancement of your own genetic lineage. For Nietzsche, aesthetic judgments of others are inescapable. Quote, "A species simply cannot do anything except say yes to itself alone like this," unquote. That's from Twilight of the Idols. The feeling of Rausch is a Geiger counter, guiding us, not to a fixed destination, but in a definite direction, towards the biological transcendence of ascending life. For Nietzsche, this is what beauty presages and what the feeling of Rausch announces. The promise of genetic immortality in forms that will incarnate ever greater reproductive fitness. All the power traits, but especially beauty, the oldest aesthetic sensibility, are the most potent promise of health, strength, pride, fecundity, joy, and immortality, of goodness itself. Indeed, all these things converge on the ultimate pre-moral good, ascending life. Beauty is the biological blessing which, if bestowed upon your descendants, grants them the best possible prospects for flourishing, for happiness. Perhaps in this nebulous, pre-conscious intuition of a glorious biological transcendence, we can unriddle the myths that pervade human cultures, the happy isles, or the place beyond the mountains, perfect paradises, at once both remote and immanent, inaccessible to us in our lifetime, but real, hyper-real. Might these conscious projections of a sublime apotheosis have their source in our unconscious instincts? If so, the transcendence they vouchsafe is not metaphysical. It is of this world, the only world, to which, as Nietzsche's Zarathustra exhorts us, we must remain faithful. Thank you. That's it for this week, folks. Please comment, like, follow, share, review, and support. Next time, the big one, our Season 1 finale. Will to Power explained in its entirety, along with its intimate relationship to that enigmatic and unpredictable dancing god of intoxication, Dionysus. Join me next time on the Will to Joy podcast. And in the meantime, live dangerously.